Hi, my name is George Annor. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Food Science and Nutrition at the University of Minnesota. I'm a cereal chemist by training, and I've been working on cereal grain quality and also work a lot with breeders to assess the changes that happens to cereal grains as the breeding goes on. For today, I'm going to be presenting on the assessment of FODMAPs and ATIs in Idaho grown wheat. And this study is based on the premise that the per capita consumption of wheat in the US has been steadily declining. Wheat consumption was about 225 pounds per capita in 1879. This reached a low of about 110 pounds in 1970, but rebounded in the year 2000 due to the popularization of flour-based foods such as pizza and also the increased interest of consumers in the use of bread machines. So that was good. But if you look at this graph, you would see that the per capita consumption of wheat has been steadily declining from the year 2000, and there don't seem to be an end to this decline. We believe that, or I believe that if the wheat industry and farmers and wheat commissions all over the US do not do anything about this, we may come to a point where people will just avoid the consumption of wheat totally, and that would have significant economic impact on farmers and the wheat industry. But why this decline? One reason is fat diets. So people are beginning to adopt certain lifestyles and eliminating starches from their diet. We know cereals contain a lot of starch, and wheat is no exception. So some of the fat diets that people practice are the paleo diet, basically eliminating gluten. So that will be, wheat will be off the map. We also have the ketogenic diet where people would eat high fat and low carb keto diets. We have the Whole30 diet where they will eat nothing but vegetables. I mean, some of these are good. We have the Mediterranean diet where we know is very common in places like in Greece, in Spain, and in Israel, where the food typically consists of fruit, vegetables, beans, and nuts. So this is one of the reasons why people are avoiding wheat in general. We also, of course, have celiac disease, and we all know this is an immune disease where people just cannot eat gluten because it damages their small intestines. Celiac disease is caused by the gluten proteins that we find in cereal grains, particularly in wheat. And so it has been a huge contributor, even though a few people in the US, just about 1% of the population has celiac disease. It has been a big thorn in the flesh of the wheat milling industry or the wheat industry in general. So wheat, rye, barley, they contain gluten, the gluten protein, which has been causing all this. So people would completely avoid wheat because of celiac disease. We also have non-allergy, non-celiac wheat sensitivity. And this non-allergy, non-celiac wheat sensitivity is defined mainly as abdominal symptoms that people would get after they ingest gluten-containing cereals. So this condition is not caused by celiac disease. So they are not necessarily reacting to the gluten protein, but they are reacting to other proteins or other components that are in the in the wheat. So what other components in the wheat can cause this NCWS? We believe one of them is FODMAPs and the other is ATI. So FODMAPs is an acronym for fermentable oligo-di and monosaccharides and polyols. Basically, these are very short chain sugars made up of fructose, and our body does not do very well with the absorption of fructose. So what happens is that they get into our large intestines, they irritate your intestinal walls, they cause a lot of bloating, they cause a lot of intestinal discomfort. So there are a lot of people who eat wheat who would have this condition, but would think they have celiac disease, but it might not necessarily be the case. ATIs is also another group of small proteins. These are not gluten proteins. They are small molecular weight proteins that also affect our intestinal walls. So this is FODMAPs, as I said. They mainly are made up of fructose, lactose, what we call fructo and galacto oligosaccharides. So fructans is one of these sugars, and galactans. You find a lot of fructans in a lot of products like onions, an example. So polyols are sugar alcohols. So mannitol, sorbitol, xylitol, and maltitol. Some of these are not and well absorbed. So again, they cause a lot of bloating and intestinal discomfort for a lot of people. The galacto-oligosaccharides, we usually find them in legumes. So we know what happens when we eat beans. You get bloated, you get a lot of discomfort. There's a lot of carbon dioxide production. And so you can have some of these. In a lot of cereals, it's more of the fructans than the galactans. So FODMAPs are poorly absorbed in the small intestines, as I said, a result in irritation of the intestines. They also result in a lot of laxative effect. They love to hold on to water. So what happens is if you eat a lot of food with a lot of FODMAPs, you get a lot of water coming into your large intestines, and then you might actually have a lot of issues with your gut mobility. So that causes a lot of discomfort to some people. There's also they are also rapidly fermented by our intestinal microflora. So even though we cannot hydrolyze it, we cannot absorb it, we cannot use it, your intestinal microorganisms would hydrolyze these, they'll ferment them, resulting in a lot of gas production, CO2 production, and a lot of intestinal distension. And that is what causes all the discomfort that people will experience. ATIs, as I said, small molecular wheat proteins. They are just 2 to 4% of wheat proteins. They evoke intestinal inflammation by activating gut and mesenteric lymph nodes. These are highly resistant to proteases and heat. So even if you cook them, or even when we add enzymes to it, so the proteases or the digestive enzymes you have would have some proteases. These proteases also they find it very difficult to hydrolyze these ATIs. So then they cause all these problems that people would also experience. So in 2019, the Minnesota Department of Agriculture did fund a project to look into FODMAPs and ATIs in wheat. This was in collaboration with the Minnesota Wheat Research and Promotion Council, and of course, University of Minnesota. We also had AURI, which is the Agriculture Utilization and Research Institute. They partnered with us on this project, and they played a significant role in the outreach. That was a huge component of this project. And also we partnered with a food company called Backwin Foods, because there was a part of that study that had to do with sourdough fermentation and how it affected these FODMAPs and ATIs. So the aim of the project was to reduce wheat sensitivity through the identification of wheat varieties with naturally low anti-nutrient levels for breeding purposes. So we wanted to be able to screen wheat samples and see whether there's any genetic link to these FODMAPs and ATIs in wheat, and get to a point where we can actually breed these components out of wheat. So that was a big part of this project. The second part was to explore fermentation. So I'll go through some highlights of the results we got, and that will lead us to the reason why it is important for us to partner with the Idaho Wheat Commission to continue this work. So for objective one of that study, we looked at characterizing the variation and identifying genetic markers for FODMAPs and ATIs. And here we looked at ancient wheat, heritage wheat, and modern wheat. And these were grown in 2 different locations. The idea for the ancient, heritage, and modern was to see whether over the years, the breeding that has been going on had affected these FODMAPs and ATIs. So that's what we looked at. So we had a panel of 200 wheat varieties. So some of them were ancient, heritage, and modern. They were grown at the University of Minnesota fields in Crookston and in St. Paul. And the panel represented heritage and had spring wheat diversity, going back to the origins of the University of Minnesota wheat breeding program. And I was told by Jim Anderson, who is our spring wheat breeder, that some of the varieties we went way back as far as 1895. And also some of the varieties came from regional breeding programs as well. So again, wheat were grown, the plots were treated with fungicide as necessary to reduce any damage from fungal pathogens. This is kind of a summary of the a distribution of the different wheat varieties that we use. So there were some durum, some Acorn, some Hermes, and some synthetic haploids as well. So these samples, after they were grown, they were harvested, they were cleaned, and then we determined the FODMAPs and ATIs using the HPLC and the high performance anionic exchange chromatography. And then genetic markers were identified for the individual FODMAPs and ATIs for breeding purposes. The genetic marker determination was done by actually extracting DNA from that panel of 200 wheat varieties, and then they were genotyped. Association mapping was also done to see whether there is that link between any genes and the FODMAPs and the ATIs. And of course, the objective too were to explore the fermentation, to give consumers the ability to at least do something at home. So if you buy wheat that has high levels of FODMAPs and ATIs, we wanted to see whether consumers can do something, or whether the baking industry can do something to also reduce the amount of FODMAPs and ATIs to ultimately reduce all the discomfort that people get when they eat wheat that has high FODMAPs and ATIs, and hopefully turn around that decline in the per capita consumption of wheat. So we made sourdough and they were prepared from 30 of the 200 varieties. We selected them because we couldn't do for all the 200 varieties. And then that sample selection was based on high and low FODMAPs, high, medium, and low FODMAPs after all the 200 varieties were screened. So we use type 1 sourdough culture, so the traditional way of making sourdough, and they were fermented at 72 degrees Fahrenheit for different hours to mimic commercial sourdough bulk fermentation. And again, after that, these doughs, not the bread, this dough, those samples were analyzed for their FODMAPs and ATIs. So these are some pictures of the wheat varieties. There were a lot of variation observed in the heading, the date, the heading date, the height, and the yield of these different varieties. And these are just pictures of some of these varieties. This here is just to show you how we determine the FODMAPs and the ATI. So we ran it on the high performance anionic exchange chromatography, and is able to identify the individual sugars, so fructose, sucrose, mannose, and all the sugars. The fructans are from here. So we have DP5 all the way to DP10 or 15. So this is how we determine them. And we put all the fructans as one group. So DP6 to 10, we add all of them as fructans. And these are some of the fructans or the sugars that causes a lot of the discomfort. So before I show any result, it is important to know the levels of FODMAPs that are adequate, especially for people with irritable bowel syndrome. So people with irritable bowel syndrome or or consumers in general need to consume FODMAPs to the level of 0.3 grams per serving. These are very small amounts. Anything more than that is known to cause a lot of issues for consumers, especially people with irritable bowel syndrome. So we have the oligosaccharides, And then, so oligosaccharides from grains and legumes, you have to have less than 0.3 grams per serving. And when we talk about per serving, it could be just 2 slices of bread. And then we have the polyols, we have the total polyols, and then the excess fructose. Excess fructose is important because the body is able to use the fructose when it has an equal amount of glucose. So if you have 10 grams of glucose, 10 grams of fructose, your body is able to use that fructose. If you have more fructose than glucose, then that excess fructose is what causes the symptoms that are associated with the consumption of high FODMAP diet. So we are looking at 0.3 grams per serving. These are the results of what we got. So FODMAPs is here on your x-axis, ATI is here on your y-axis. And it was obvious that there is a wide distribution of the amount of FODMAPs and ATIs in the wheat samples we actually analyzed. Now, if I put in our 0.3% target, you could see that very few of the wheat varieties are actually below that target. Most of the wheat varieties that we analyzed had FODMAP levels that were significantly higher than the target that is expected to be suitable for consumers, and especially people with irritable bowel syndrome. So we have a problem. And the earlier we deal with this problem, the better it is. But again, looking at the distribution, it is obvious that the variation in there means that we possibly may be able to identify genes that are controlling these amounts of FODMAPs or ATIs in our products. So that was good news to us. Now, this slide here also gives an idea of how much FODMAPs we have in various food products that we eat. You can see rice has nothing. So noodles, pasta from quinoa, pasta from gluten-free wheat, gluten-free grains, bread from gluten-free grains, cornflakes from gluten-free grains, rice bubbles, they all are below the cutoff level that is needed for people who react to these components. As you go down, once we start using wheat, pasta, wholemeal bread, whole biscuit cereal, couscous, we really are over that threshold. And this, I think, it is one of the reasons why people react. I have had people ask me that anytime they go to Europe and they eat breads in Europe, they actually don't react as breads that they eat in the US. And my answer to people who ask me those is that it could be due to the fact that in breads in Europe, they might have lower levels of FODMAS because they do extended fermentation. There's a lot of sourdough bread that are available in Europe. Here in the US, it is not the case. Most of the bread we go through a very short time for bread making. There's not enough time for fermentation. So most of the most of our wheat products actually will contain higher levels of these FODMAPs and ATIs. That is why it is important for us to look at it from a breeding standpoint, look at it from the grain itself. If we can find a way to reduce the amount of FODMAPs and ATIs in the grain to start with, the amount in the final product will be significantly different. And this is why this study is very important. This slide here shows the FODMAP levels in the wheat over the years. So because we looked at wheat from as far back as 1875 all the way to modern wheat, we see some variations as the years go by. But if I'm to draw a line through these points, you could see that the amount of FODMAPs has remained consistent, generally consistent over the years, even with all the breeding that is going on. If we can significantly reduce the amount of FODMAPs in our wheat varieties, then we won't be worried about it going up again in the future, because our result shows that it does not really respond a lot to, it has not responded in a negative way to all the breeding that has gone on over the years. When we look at the ATIs, however, we see a slight increase in ATI. This is because over the years, protein content in wheat has increased, and ATIs are part of the protein. So an increase in protein content will also result in an increase in the ATIs. So this is a concern because we typically will breed for increased protein content. So we need to find a way to identify the genes responsible for controlling ATI, so that even if we have to increase the total protein content, we can reduce or keep the amount of ATIs consistent. This here shows what we call the Manhattan plots, and these plots are basically trying to find genes that are correlated to the parameters that we measure, so the FODMAPs and the ATIs. The red lines you see here are what we call the significant level. So anything above any dot above that red line indicate that that gene on the x-axis has a significant influence on the parameter. So these are all individual genes. And we can see that very few of the genes are actually above that white line. So this here from this study, we did not really get a good hand on the genes that are responsible for the FODMAPs. And we believe that we didn't really screen a lot of samples. And that is why, because most of the samples we screened here came from Minnesota and regional breeding programs. But we believe that if we screen wheat samples from different parts of the US or different parts of the world, it will really give us a clear idea of what genes are responsible. And that is why we are happy to partner with the Idaho Wheat Commission to screen wheat samples from Idaho to see if it would have an impact on these results. This is just one slide showing how fermentation significantly reduces the amount of fructans. So if you ferment, or if you make sourdough bread, or if you make regular bread, but you have an extended fermentation time, you are more likely to reduce the amount of fructans. We also saw the same effect in ATIs. The amount of reduction in ATIs was not as pronounced as in the fructans, as you can see on this particular slide, but still, fermentation did have an effect on the FODMAPs and ATIs. It resulted in a significant decrease in the FODMAPs and ATIs. So at the end of the study, we reported the FODMAP content of 0.4 to 1.2% in the wheat samples that we analyzed. ATIs was 1.8 to 3.9%, and corn had low ATI values and also FODMAPs. So there are wheat varieties that inherently have low amounts of these FODMAPs and ATI. So if we can find the genes that result in these low levels in, say, corn and MS, that would be a good way to incorporate them into our modern wheat. As I said, we didn't really have any genetic region. We didn't see any genetic region responsible for a large portion of the variations that we found in these traits. But still, Jim Anderson, our breeder, tells me that they are still amenable to selection. We didn't find any identifiable patterns regarding FODMAPs and ATI concentration on a year-on-year basis, which is good. And of course, sourdough fermentation reduced FODMAPs and ATIs. So what next? We think that there's a need to screen more wheat varieties from different locations in the US. We also have very little information on the levels of FODMAPs and ATIs in different classes of wheat, because that was not part of the study and we haven't seen it anywhere else. We also have very little information on the impact of processing. So in our study, we looked at the sourdough. We did not actually bake the bread. Now, if we bake the bread, what impact will it have on the amount of FODMAPs and ATIs? These are questions, or these are information that are critical for us to understand how FODMAPs impact, how processing impact, and how FODMAPs vary in the different classes of wheat. And that is why this study is being proposed. So the objectives are to determine FODMAPs and ATIs in 4 wheat classes grown in 4 different locations in Idaho. We also want to evaluate the effect of bread production on FODMAPs and ATIs. And of course, we want to work with ARI to establish pathway for industry, for emerging farmers to implement the findings of these processes or these studies. These are the samples that we want to work on, and these samples have already been sent to me. I already have these samples. I'm ready to start analyzing them, and hopefully we get the funding to be able to do this, but we are ready to go. I think this is an interesting study to do, especially the part on the effect of bread processing and also the part on trying to figure out whether the different classes of wheat vary in the levels of FODMAPs and ATIs. We believe this project will complement effort being made by states where wheat contributes significantly to their economies, like in Idaho and also in Minnesota. And we believe that we may be able to have some effects or have some effect on hopefully reversing the progressive decline in the consumption of wheat. This study will also form the basis for understanding of the levels of FODMAPs and ATIs in wheat in the US. In countries like in Australia and in New Zealand, there have been a lot of effort to push the consumption of low FODMAP diet, and it's actually catching up. That market is actually growing steadily because people see the need to eat product with low FODMAPs and ATIs. We know for sure private industry is interested in increasing wheat product sales to its consumers. And of course, this would be possible if they are able to give consumers product that won't cause a lot of discomfort. In fact, we had a company that was very interested in partnering with us on this. Consumers have also indicated their desire for more digestible wheat product. If we make these products available, if we make wheat that are more digestible, that won't cause a lot of discomfort, consumers will definitely buy them. And that would have a lot of economic impact on farmers and on the wheat industry as in general. So we believe that this research will benefit and add value to Idaho wheat growers by increasing the demand of wheat products and acreage, in that it will respond to consumer requests for more digestible wheat products. In a 2003 report, it was in 2003, it was reported that low FODMAP diet or low FODMAP foods grew by 66%. Sorry, interest in low FODMAP foods grew by 66% over the past year. So there's a big interest. It is growing. People are becoming more and more aware of FODMAPs. People are becoming aware of the fact that it is not just gluten that is causing that problem, and it is FODMAPs, and they probably can still eat that wheat if they can be tested to ensure that they don't have celiac disease. According to Monash University, the low FODMAP diet has helped about 75% of people with irritable bowel syndrome. This is an affliction that actually affect about 25 to 45 million people in the US. And most of these people will stay away from wheat. So hopefully, if we are able to get wheat varieties that won't cause this discomfort, a lot of these people would start consuming wheat again, and hopefully we would have an increase in the per capita consumption of wheat. It is also important that if you go outside of the US, irritable bowel syndrome affects about 10 to 15% of the world's population. That is a lot of people, and people are becoming more and more aware that they probably might have irritable bowel syndrome. And when they know that, of course, they will stay away from wheat. In terms of transfer of technology, we would work extensively with ARI. They helped a lot with the outreach and dissemination of the findings of the study that was funded by the state of Minnesota. So we will build up on the farmer to value chain outcomes demonstrated in our 2009 study. And ARI will engage to continue to foster relationships, which include wheat growers, the industry, processes, related organizations, national and regional wheat organizations to expand the network of people working on FODMAPs and ATIs. And hopefully we can include Idaho wheat growers and the wheat milling industry in Idaho. So this is a 3-year project. Year 1 will focus on screening the samples for the FODMAPs and ATIs. And some of this will still carry on in year 2, but in year 2, we'll be focusing on looking at the effect of bread production on from FODMAPs and ATIs. In year 3, we'll be doing a lot of the outreach, and Ari will be responsible for that. A lot of the details is actually outlined in the proposal, but they did a great job with the outreach on their 2019 study, and I know they will do a very good job with this study as well. Total budget for the project is 59,400, and this is for 3 years. So the first year, we're looking at 17,500, second year, 17,700. And then the year 3 will be 24,100 because there's the component of Ari's outreach expenses. So most of this budget would go into part salary for a technician who will be doing the screening, and also part salary, part of my summer salary as a PI. We'll also use some of it to buy lab supplies. We'll buy standards for measuring the FODMAPs. There's some money allocated for travel for me to be able to come to the meetings in Idaho and present the findings for this project. And also most of this money, especially in year 3, would go to outreach activities by Ari. So thank you very much. And I hope that we will be able to start this project soon. And we are happy, the University of Minnesota, or myself and Ari, we are happy to partner with the Idaho Wheat Commission to make this happen. Thank you very much.